Nicolas, I'm a member of the R&D team and I'm a member of the SAS team, the team which is responsible of the deployment of the Odoo online platform. And I'm also a member of the migration team. The subject today is to talk to you about the deployment of Odoo, from starting to running. It's a bit different to start Odoo in a command prompt and run Odoo in production. The idea is to be able to run Odoo in production. Don't hesitate to put your questions in the chatter. There will be a question and answer session at the end of this talk. My main advice is keep it stupid and simple. The way is be able to, you should not be the only one who is able to solve the issues of the system. Everybody should be able to solve the issues on the system. If you deploy a complex system, the system will fail when you are on holiday, when you are on honeymoon, and on weekend. It will not fail on Monday at 10 o'clock. It will not fail when you are fully available to solve the issues. Shit happens, and not when you are able to handle it. The second advice is also keep it safe and secure. We are talking about an ERP system. If this system is down, it's probably all of your business which is down. It's not safe to have your business down due to an IT issue. So please keep it safe, keep it secure, and have multiple people be able to solve your issues. Don't keep all the information for yourself and be the only one able to solve the issues. That said, here is the way to start Odoo. You simply start Odoo bin and Odoo is running. Odoo is only running in community version with the default add-ons. The first parameter we will use is having the add-ons pass. This add-ons pass will permit you to add new modules to the community version. The first one we are talking about are the enterprise version, and you could also use all the community add-ons for your system. You can also build your own add-ons and add them in the add-ons pass. When you run Odoo this way, Odoo will run with threads. Due to Python GIL, your system will only use one CPU at a time. That means your system has multiple CPUs, but you use only one. It's not safe for production. For production, you should use workers. Workers are a process. Each process will be able to use up to one CPU. The more workers you will put in your system, the more CPU you will use on your servers. You have two kinds of workers you can choose the number of. The regular workers, which will handle the HTTP requests, and the cron workers, which will handle the cron jobs. And you have a third worker. You don't have control on this worker. It's called the long polling worker. You can notice that when Odoo starts, this long polling worker is running on a different IP port. If you use Odoo this way, you will notice in your logs a bus.bus exception. Here is the message you will get in your logs. To solve this, you should use a web server. This web server in reverse proxy mode will permit to split the requests between the HTTP port and the long polling port. This web server will also handle the HTTPS, the safe part of the deployment. In Odoo, you will have to set the proxy mode because you have a proxy server in front of it. You can choose the HTTP port, you can choose the long polling port, and I advise you to use the HTTP interface to only listen on localhost. This way, everybody is supposed to use Nginx or whichever web server you're using to access Odoo and not Odoo itself. You can find on the odoo.com/documentation multiple examples of the Nginx configuration. When we are using workers, a Python mechanism is when Python uses memory, it doesn't release this memory, which means the more the worker is working and using memory, the more the memory consumption is on the server. To solve this, there is a mechanism in Odoo which is recycling workers. Recycling workers means killing a worker and launch a new one. There is multiple limits for those recycling. The limit memory, soft and hard, control the memory consumption. The main difference is when Odoo confirms the memory soft limit, he handles the request up to the end and then is recycled. When Odoo reaches the hard limit, the worker is killed, doesn't send HTTP response, and is recycled. You have the limit time CPU and real to control the CPU limit. The difference is limit time real is some type of whole time consumption, and the limit time CPU is only the CPU used by Python itself. For cron, you have a different limit to avoid having a too high limit due to cron. A number of requests is also a limit. Here you have an example. After 8,000 requests, the worker is recycled. Behind Odoo, you have a database. This database is PostgreSQL. You can use either the stock version of PostgreSQL or apt.postgresql.org if you are using Debian or Ubuntu. Don't use PostgreSQL with the default configuration. You have to configure PostgreSQL. My main advice here is use a basic tool which will configure it for you. pgtune.leopard.in.ua. If you want network connection to PostgreSQL, you will also have to look at the pghpa.conf file. When you are using pgtune, here is the layout of the system. This system will ask you basic questions like the database version, the OS type, the kind of database, memory, CPU, and so on. This will give you some text file. You copy paste this text file in the postgresql.conf and you're gone. We now have an Odoo and a PostgreSQL, and we want Odoo and PostgreSQL on different servers. To achieve this, we should connect to PostgreSQL using the network. For now, by default, Odoo is connecting to PostgreSQL using a Unix socket. We want to use the network. The PostgreSQL user Odoo is using to connect to PostgreSQL should not be a super user. It should only log in and maybe create databases. I highly doubt that in production this user should create database. You should also use secure connection between Odoo and PostgreSQL. If you're working on some SaaS offers like the one from Microsoft or Amazon or whatever, you will encrypt communication between Odoo and your database. All of this is possible with Odoo. You can control the database user used by Odoo to connect to PostgreSQL as well as the password, the host to connect to, the port to connect to, and by default the SSL mode is used in Odoo to connect to PostgreSQL, but you can change this behavior. And the last parameter regarding the database connection is the dbmaxcon. Keep you should be aware that this parameter is a per worker parameter. So it's not the number of connections the whole Odoo will use to connect to PostgreSQL. This is the number of connections each worker can use to connect to PostgreSQL. If you have only one database behind your Odoo deployment, you will use 1 or 2 connections per worker. This parameter is also taken into account by the long polling worker. This long polling worker is a multi-threaded worker, and this worker needs a higher number of connections. So this db maxcon should be as high as needed by the long polling worker. The default value for this parameter is 64. We are now in Odoo. We have a database. Maybe we have multiple databases in our PostgreSQL cluster, and we want to choose which database to use with Odoo. This is required by the website module. If you are using the website module, it's mandatory to set this parameter. Do you want your end user to choose a database when they reach your website? No. So the -- database is your friend here. DB filter will restrict the list of database the system will have access to. The no database list will restrict the access to the database manager. On production, it's mandatory to set no database list. And finally, an accent is a parameter which will be used by languages with accents to have PostgreSQL to use an extension to be able to search on some terms with accents. Of course, your system will send mails. We are an online system. You should set default values for the default mail server used by Odoo. I know you can control this in the Odoo backend, but it's safe to set a default value. You can control the email from the SMTP server, the SMTP connection, and so on. Of course, we are in production. We need logs. Remember that shit happens. We should know why. We should know what's going on. So you can control the logs of the server. Don't debug in production. Don't set the log level too high for production. Just set the log level to a reasonable value. You'll be able to set the log level or the log handler. The log level is a shortcut for the log handler. If you are comfortable, you can use the log handler, but at the beginning, just use the log level. You can send the logs to a log file, a database, or syslog. We have an Odoo server in front of a PostgreSQL server. Maybe we want to have multiple Odoo servers or to store the file store on the database server. To do this, you should share the file store. The file store handle all the binary content of the files as well as the sessions. You can use technologies like NFS to do this, but you can use whichever technology you're comfortable with. The parameter is data dir, and you just choose where your file store is located. If you plan to use multiple servers, you should share the code between the various servers using the same technology as example we use for the file store. If you don't do this, you will face issues. All the assets of Odoo are computed based on the modification date of the files. If this modification date is different from server to server, assets are different from server to servers, and you will constantly rebuild assets, and your system will be rapidly down. So you should share the code between all the servers. It's not because it's cool, it's not because we want this, it's because technically it's required to avoid asset issues. we now have the possibility to have multiple Odoo servers in front of our PostgreSQL servers. Then we will deploy multiple Odoo servers in front of our Odoo servers. Users will reach your server with an URL. You have multiple techniques to reach different servers. One of them is load balancing the requests between Odoo servers. Some technologies we're using to achieve this is called HA proxy. HA proxy is a load balancer, but some customers use other load balancer, proprietary load balancer provided by their online platform or their SaaS provider or whatever. Finally, we use all those options in command line. It's possible to save all of this in a configuration file. You should use --config to specify which file to use, and you can use --save to save all the parameters in this file. In production, we don't want the demo data, so without demo is safe. And in Odoo, you have wizards. They are called transient modules. We should clean those data. Those data should not remain in the database. The database should be clean. You have the control of which record to delete. You can either delete them by matter of age, by default 4 hours, or a maximum table size. The SaaS platform is available from Odoo. You can use SaaS platforms from Amazon. You can use SaaS platforms from Google, from Microsoft, from whoever. I will now answer to your questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to the Q&A session after Nicolas' talk. Let's dive right into the questions that you guys have. Feel free to ask your questions now in the chat. So what do we have here, Nicolas? There's a question, an interesting question from Mohammed, asking if there is a checklist of things to be aware of and to check when you are moving your Odoo instances between different servers. Do we have advice for that?
You have multiple points to check when moving from one server to another, and some of them are fully useful for backups as well. First of all, when you backup the database, you need also to backup the file store, because some files are really important and stored in the file store. You can skip the session if you want, but the file store are mandatory. Other points are all data within Odoo are stored in UTC, so we are a bit agnostic of the time zone of the server. So when you are moving from one server to another, you should skip this point. A point you should not skip is about the database. You should keep the same local in the database for collation in the database when moving from one server to another. Of course, you should also be aware of the version you deploy, and especially the commits you deploy when you move from one server to another. Generally speaking, you want only to change one thing at a time, and you prefer to keep the exact same version when running from one server to another. If you are running the PostgreSQL version, the stock PostgreSQL version of your Unix distribution, and you change the version of your Unix distribution, let's say you move from Ubuntu 18 to Ubuntu 20, you will change from PostgreSQL 10 to PostgreSQL 12, so you should be aware of some little changes in configuration between those two different versions. That's the main point you should take care of when moving from one server to the other.
All right, let's move on to a different question. So we have a question, I guess a simple one from Dom Benz here, asking, is it possible to run two different Odoo instances with different URLs and websites on a single server machine? So
Odoo is a multi-tenant server, which means behind one Odoo instance with the exact same versions and the exact same module versions, you can have multiple databases. You can restrict the database Odoo have access to with a parameter, the DB name. In the DB name, you can, in the DB filter parameter, you can use a special kind of filter. You have %H and %D, which are the fully qualified domain name of the machine, or the first name in the fully qualified domain name of the machine. And this will match the database with this name. So if you have company A database and company B database, you can run www.companyaa.com, which will be connected to the first database, and www.company B, which will be connected to the company B database. That way, you will run two different databases with only one server, but the two servers will run the exact same version of the code. If your question is, can I run multiple Odoo servers on the same physical server? Yes, you can. You simply have to change the IP ports of the Odoo instance, as well as the long polling port. Odoo is running behind two IP ports, and with your web server in front of your two Odoo servers running on the same machine, you will be able to redirect to one server or another.
I guess that answers perfectly. And there is actually another question that is on the same area. Someone is asking, Jefferson is asking, what load balancer we recommend using along with Odoo. So I guess that makes sense if you are deploying also several databases on the same server. So do we have any recommendation or ones that we are familiar with that we know that work well?
My recommendation is use the one you know, and use the one you master, and use the one you are not the only one to master. If your company is comfortable with one reverse load balancer, and you have already this load balancer deployed on your network, I would say use this one. We are using HA proxy as a load balancer, but this doesn't mean this is the only one you can use. If you go on the Odoo website, I don't think you'll find HA proxy configuration samples. If you go on GitHub on the technical training repository, you will find some samples of configuration of HA proxy, because it's an exercise within the deployment process of Odoo, but it's not mandatory to use this one. You can use the one you want.
All right. Another question we have here is, do we have any recommendation? It's a question from JR. Do we have any recommendations for correctly deleting fields and views to avoid internal server errors? So I guess that's an interesting one.
To avoid internal server errors when deleting views or fields, first of all, you have to test it, and not doing a test in production. It seems really basic, but that's the first point. If you have your server running and you want to update a module, you are within the interface and you can safely click on the update button, All views without XML ID in your module will be deleted. All the fields which are not found by the update process will be deleted as well by the update process. And all the Odoo workers will be aware of this change by a signaling through the database. And this signaling through the database will make the worker to reload the new registry when the update is finished. If you are talking about the command line, the way to do this is just to issue a -u base or your module on the server.
Right. Well, I think we don't have much more time for another question. So maybe we can ask people if you have more questions to join us in one of the technical rooms. I don't know.
Of course, I'm available in the upgrade room, so feel free to come in the upgrade room and we'll discuss about all the questions you can have after this talk.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you were enjoying the Odoo experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.